I'm Ed Schultz, and yes, welcome to Penn Yan Action Coalition's Community Read. Couple of things first. I wanted to take this time to identify the members of the Penn Yan Action Coalition that have been working diligently over the last year. We have Scarlett Emerson, who is our chairperson, myself, my wife, Mickey Schultz, Claudia Guthrie, who will be speaking and sharing with you in a moment, Nancy Richardson, Cindy Gorham Creveling, Alex, Peggy Sewell, Ann Meyer Wilbur, Debbie Coop, John Hunter, Linda Raid, Columba Salamone, and Alejandra Molina. And we thank everyone for their hard efforts this past year. Just in case, a little bit of background, the Penn Yan Action Coalition was started back in 2018 as a group that was interested in sharing immigration issues that were affecting different groups in our community that worked in the wine, dairy, and construction industries. These individuals provide a great service to our area. And we wanted to make sure that some of their issues were front and center. And so we are trying to inform the community about some of these issues. The initial reason we started was because a Mexican friend of ours was illegally arrested and eventually deported to Mexico. About a year later, his wife joined him, and they are living there. Their children, who are American citizens, are living and working in the Penn Yan area. We have a little different format, which is interesting this year because we're doing both Zoom and live here in the library. And lastly, for me, I wanted to make you aware of some links online. You can get some additional information about Qian Julie Wang by going to her name, qianjuliewang.com, and you'll find some information there about her and some podcasts that she has done. And also there are a number of videos, interviews that she has done on YouTube. And they're not all connected to the book. There's some very interesting additional comments that she has made about other topics. And again, by the way of updates, she is now 36 years old. She lives with her husband in Brooklyn, and they have formed a law firm, Gottlieb and Wang, and they work in New York to help with educational civil rights for marginalized populations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claudia and begin our discussion.
All right, well, it's good to see everybody. And I know that this is a Friday afternoon and it's beautiful out, so I'm especially grateful that you all took the time to be here. I think that we think there's a great value in reading the same book together and having a discussion about it, especially like when they're nonfiction books, because it allows us to experience things that we might not otherwise experience, and it allows us to walk in somebody else's shoes and see things through their eyes. And, especially in this community, we're a pretty homogeneous community. We don't have a lot of diversity here. So I think it's good for us to be able to read books that have been written by people who've had other experiences. And I think that in so doing, we find out that in spite of our external differences, different languages and different foods, different cultural backgrounds, inside, we're really all the same. We all have the same ambitions and desires and fears and hopes and dreams. we're all part of the human race. And I think the only way for us to come together is just to get to meet people and to, understand them. And when we can't do that in person, books can fill that void or fill that gap. Probably most of you have read the book, so you have some information on the author. You know that it's a best-selling book. And Ed's filled you in a little bit on the author. Basically, it's a memoir, but it only covers like about 5 years of the author's life. She talks about her life as a child, and I think that we need to pay attention to children. They're the most vulnerable part of our society. They really are at the mercy of adults. They really don't have much control over their lives. Parents, adults make those decisions, governments, countries make those decisions, and they're at the mercy of those things. So before we start, I know you've read it, but I'd like to just reread it real quick and then we'll get started. She gives a purpose for her book at the end of her introduction, and I'm just going to read it again for you. It says, "Most of all, though, I put these stories to paper for this country's forgotten children, past and present, who grew up cloaked in fear, desolation, and the belief that their very existence is wrong, their very being illegal. I have been unfathomably lucky, but I dream of a day when being recognized as human requires no luck, when it is a right and not a privilege." And then she goes on a little bit, and she also has some words from her mother. "With your writing, Qian, you can do anything. One day you will have enough to eat. One day you will have everything." And, hope is a common human emotion. So basically, we're just kind of going to turn it over to you. Ed and I are just going to facilitate. If necessary, we'll move the conversation along, but I think all of you have things to share. You can share some part of the book that was really memorable for you, that impacted you, that stood out for you. You can feel free to share an insight that you got from the book, things that you learned. You could share connections or parallels to other books or movies or experiences that you have experienced. You can share questions that you have about the book. So I guess we'll just start off maybe with what's a part of the book that you found memorable? And so anybody can chime in here. I guess you can raise your hand. Some of you have on your screen, there's a little hand you can put up, and then Alex will be watching those in the library in case they have questions. So who we got would like to share something that impacted you or that you thought was memorable?
So I just talk.
Yep, I can hear you now.
All right, so Cindy?
Yes. I'm not sure folks on Zoom can see these, but over on the windowsill, there are 4 books that Qian Julie mentions in her book, and she loved libraries. That's how she learned English. And Harriet the Spy was one of her favorites, and she wrote. She wanted to be a detective in New York City. So she had a lot of documentation from journaling as a young girl, 7 to 12 years old, where she took notes like Harriet the Spy did. And so that's one of the reasons that she had all this information that helped her, which she actually wrote the book on her phone on the subway going to work as an adult. There are 2 of the Julie books. I think Julie and the Wolves and Julie. She chose the name Julie from after reading those books. They meant so much to her. And also the Babysitter's Club. She loved that series, and she wanted to belong. She wanted to be American, and she saw how other children were American through these books. So fitting that we're in a library, and that the library was she just loved it. Okay.
Did anybody have any response to her experiences in school? I mean, I guess she's trying to learn the language and they're putting her in a special class, and she was reading like Clifford, the Big Red Dog, things like that. But even then she was teaching herself. And I guess, what are your thoughts on the school system or the educational system? Do you think that it failed her? I mean, she's teaching herself to read. And I think when she went to the library, it said that was the first time she was learning what the words meant, but she didn't know what they sounded like. So when she went to the read aloud program at the library, she could hear how the words sounded. So I don't know, what were your thoughts on, I guess, our failure or success at teaching children to speak English? And should that have been the school's responsibility? Should they have done a better job?
Well, I think some of her teachers helped and some did not. The one teacher was not very supportive and basically told her that she wasn't going to get anywhere because of her background.
I had another thought. I know that she and her family spoke Mandarin. Most of the other children that were in the Chinese children, they spoke Cantonese.
Cantonese.
And she was really ridiculed because of the difference. And apparently Mandarin is the language of the intellectuals in China. And her parents were both professors. And so even within the Chinese community, she was ridiculed and had a very challenging time within the school system. So I thought that was so sad.
Oh, I'm sorry, Anne, your hand is up. Go. Yes.
I think one of the teacher-student interactions that really impressed me, I mean, I even paused while I was reading, was her interaction with Mr. Kane, who called her up one day and commented, "What's with the overalls? This isn't a farm," because they were so poor that she wore the same clothes every day. I mean, they described that several times in the book, and I can't believe there would be such misunderstanding about what poverty really means. And I thought more deeply as well about how much fear just drove their lives, that it wasn't just poverty, it was fear of breaking away or exploring anything new. And I also I was thinking about the sweatshops and how she worked in sweatshops alongside her mom. And now I'm going to look at the tag "Made in the USA" a little bit differently. And I'm going to think to myself, does "Made in the USA" mean that people are being exploited in this country? I don't know. Those were some of the biggest things that stood out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I know when I was reading that part about when she was working in I guess it was a fish processing plant, it was the most horrendous job. The fact that she is a child too, and that they allowed this child to work there with her mother. And we think this is just one isolated incident, but I know in the news very recently, they were investigating, I think it was like 100 underage children were working at 13 different slaughterhouses in this country. This is within the last few months. And I think this is what happens when people are living in the shadows. They can be taken advantage of. There's not much they can say if somebody's going to not pay them the minimum wage, or they're not going to give them safe working conditions. It's like, what are they going to do? There's nothing that they can say. It's really slave labor. And it's happening in this country. And I even think, like, during the pandemic, we had all these essential workers who are working in the meat processing plants that were getting sick, and they had no health insurance. If they left, they weren't even being protected on the floor where they were working. And so it's going on today.
I think that's one of the things that struck me about her experience, is that to think that roughly 30 years ago, and now in light of what we were hearing about some of these processing plants, that these sweatshops, were commonplace. And, that in my lifetime, 30 years ago, is not that long ago. I'm sure for some of you it's different, but that just stood out for me, that here was a child that had to experience that sort of situation.
I don't know how many of you have read, I can't remember I think it was called the Boarding House Boys or the Bunkhouse Boys. But this was a group of mentally disabled men who were kept in a boarding house and worked in a plant that processed turkeys. And it describes the horrific conditions that these men lived in. And again, they were basically hostages. So they have people that work in these jobs. Nobody else wants these jobs. And, so unless you're in a situation where this is the only job that you can get, people aren't working in those places. But yeah, so it's not just, immigrants. We have other groups of people in our country that are being abused in the workplace. I know Anne mentioned Mr. Kane, and I was just thinking even about just children in general, or children living in poverty. The gift exchange. It's not something maybe some of you think about very much, but when you're living in poverty, even the gift exchange was a situation where a child is caused to feel shame and humiliation and embarrassment. I don't know what you guys think about that, how that should have been handled, these gift exchanges.
We got somebody coming up.
I'm Jan
Yeah.
Whitcomb, and I have to admit, I haven't read the book. I sort of came lately to this whole, finding out about
Okay.
it.
Yes.
But as an English as a new language teacher for over 30 years, I do want to speak in defense
Yeah.
of the English
Yes.
teachers.
Yes.
I was kind of a buffer between the general culture and my students' cultures. And when it came to things like, we didn't have any gift exchanges, but when it came to things like celebrating Christmas, which should not be done in public schools, or Halloween, I was the buffer, and I was the one who had to explain to the other teachers, these children don't do masks, they don't do costumes, they can't eat pizza with pepperoni. So there, and most of all of my colleagues were, as I'll give myself credit, as sensitive as I was. So there are many teachers out there who are aware of the cultural differences. I had students from China, India, Iraq, Afghanistan, South America, you name it. And there are many of us who are aware of these cultural differences and are really trying hard to be a bridge. And the thing about the child wearing the same clothes, I don't know how many times I had to explain to teachers, first of all, in China, the children don't change clothes every day. And secondly, these parents don't have a washing machine and dryer in their homes. And what difference does it make? So anyway, again, I want to speak on behalf of all of the English as a new language teachers who really do work hard to bridge the gaps.
Thank you. Well, I'm a retired English teacher, so I do know, but I know that there's good teachers and bad teachers out there. And
Where did you teach? Locally around here or in another state?
are you asking me
No,
where I
I
taught?
was
Or
asking-
Jen?
Yeah. The gal
did
that
you
just
teach?
I
spoke.
taught for a while in Connecticut, and most of my career was in the Rush Henrietta Central School District outside of Rochester. And we had a very diverse population.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that's what's important. I think it's important for us to be aware of these differences and to be sensitive to them. I know the other thing that kind of floored me with Mr. Kane was when he told the students that the reason their parents were working in these menial jobs was because they were uneducated. And again, just a demonstration of his lack of understanding of the situation that his children were coming from. Her parents weren't working in these jobs because they were uneducated.
One of the things, I'll throw out a question that when I was growing up and when my children were growing up, a half day of school was a great thing. You didn't have to go all day. But she was in fear of half days. And I wonder if any of you out there remember why she was in fear of half days. I think that was in chapter 7. And here again, it goes to culture, part of it. But she was in fear because of bathroom situations. And she couldn't go to the bathroom and had to wait until she got either to the sweatshop or her father's office. And half days meant that she had to wait a long time. And I don't think most of us even think about that either.
So does anybody, I know if there's different things, I guess, that I think about. I know they've been shared about the teacher, about the sweatshop, those different things. I'm thinking too about even just the fact that I guess what living in the shadows did to her parents and their relationship and their marriage and all of that, if you had thoughts about that and how that affected them. And just the expectations that people had, like of her father, he resented even being called Asian. It was like everybody from every country from that part of the world was just kind of all lumped together. You're all Asians, and this is the picture that we have of Asian people, and this is what we expect. And it kind of alludes to that whole model minority thing. You're supposed to not cause any trouble, keep your head down, don't say anything. But what does that do psychologically to a person? Think about like her parents.
Claudia, we had Elizabeth with a hand up.
Oh, okay, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Well, I was really on the last topic, kind of. I guess one of the things that's really striking to me, because what I reread was the very end when they were moving to Canada, and then the last part where she talked about, her own story and all of that this story is so much in the voice and experience of a small child in a strange place. Again, I mean, the culture is so different. She has no siblings, and her relationships with her parents is partly from her own culture, and then of course the fact that, at least certainly from her point of view, there wasn't very much that was responsive to her needs. I mean, you think of her mother going through the surgery and the story with the cat. The cat was a friend, and then all of a sudden the cat was something that was going to threaten her relationship with her mother. I found that to be one of the most striking, painful. I mean, I've read a lot of books and stories from children's perspectives, but it just, that the voice of most of the book is this small child trying to make sense of her world and trying to negotiate it and live out what she felt were her commitments, like to her mother especially. I mean, the different relationship that she had with her parents. But I was quite relieved to read at the end of the fact that she finally had somebody in her life who understood the trauma that she'd been through and, began to take apart those pieces, I'm not worthy. I don't belong, all of those things. That was the part I wanted to read a second time, just because, after all of that, I mean, I had the feeling it was longer than 5 years, but that may just have been because it was so detailed.
Right.
I was just relieved at the end to know that, obviously if she's written a story like this, she's seeing it, but I just thought it was incredibly powerful that she could capture that, recapture that little girl, and especially love the part about how, she couldn't get rid of that little girl. So she finally, figured out she just better let her be part of her life and listen to her and that kind of thing. That was my response to reading the book.
In one of the interviews, people asked her how she was able to get that voice, and she said she kept extensive journals. And I think Cindy alluded to one where she read Harriet the Spy or something like that, and she wanted to be like that, and so she kept journals. So she had those to go back to. Because normally, as an adult, it's very difficult to remember the thoughts and the feelings that you had as a child, but she did keep journals and she was able to go back to those. But I think it was difficult, that this is a child who's having to really be an adult and to live in the constant fear and the feeling that she doesn't belong, comes through. I don't know if it's in the book or maybe it was in the interviews, but she just talks about, not seeing yourself. Like when you read books, she enjoyed books and she loved books, but she didn't see herself in the books. She didn't see people like her in the movies. And so she felt there was something wrong with her. And I guess I'm wondering how you all feel like when you go to the movies and you see parts being played by, whether it's Native Americans, and a white person is playing that part. It's like you have all these different ethnic backgrounds, and Hollywood always casts a white person in the role. They're getting better because people are speaking up, but that's the way it's been. And how do what does that do to a person? And should that be? I know that's something that's going to be touched on in the second book of our read, but I think it's worth mentioning now. Yes, Nancy, make sure you unmute yourself. Okay.
Hi. My hand is up, but I didn't read the book, but I found out about it a little later, and happy to be here. I just think there's a conversation going around of who has the right to write what you don't know or live. In the book world, there's been a lot of heated debate and interesting conversations around that. I don't think it's a problem in cases where it's meant to enlighten, and if its purpose is an intention is to really expand information, ways of seeing things. I don't think that's the issue. But if in cases where there is a better way to do it by having the real people represent roles, especially in Hollywood, it perpetuates the idea that the very people that they're playing aren't worthy enough of playing those roles. And there's a huge missed opportunity of getting to know these potential actors and what gifts they could bring to the role from their perspective, from their personal perspectives as well. So I think it perpetuates things, but there's a fine line, and depending on the media, I think there is a creative right to express something if you're truly interested in wanting to really share, something bigger. But in Hollywood, I think they need to do a better job, and I'm glad that they're getting that kind of pressure from everyone. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Anybody else? I was thinking of Elizabeth was talking about the end of the book. I know at the end of the book, they're crossing into Canada, and Qian says that something unthinkable happened. I don't know how many of you read that part. The unthinkable was that someone smiled at her. The guard smiled at her and said, "Welcome home. And I thought, how sad that she'd been in this country for all these years and never had been made to feel welcome or a part, of this beautiful country. And that would just seem so amazing to her. She had lived in so much fear all of her life. And here somebody just smiled and just said, welcome home. This is from a Canadian Guard at the border. So
I think we got somebody stepping up here to build on that.
all right.
Hi.
Hi, Scarlett.
Yes, I would like to recommend the interview that she does at Northeastern University. I just looked at it moments before I came over here this afternoon. And first of all, I think I was struck with what a wonderful woman she has become. Exceedingly articulate and sensitive. And I learned so much from her just in the 45 minutes or so that while I was eating lunch and getting ready to come over here. But one of the things that she recounted was, and it builds on the notion that somebody smiled at her because she was asked, do you have hope? Because she'd spent a lot of time talking about activism and what happened in Atlanta with the women being shot and a lot of all of that sort of horrible stuff. And she said, well, yes, she did. And this very day, that very day that she was having the interview, because she had stopped at a restaurant to pick up some lunch. And she was waiting for the person to bring her the lunch. And a young teenager came rushing in and said to her, table for 4. And she says, I didn't even look up from my phone. I just said, I don't work here. And she said the teenager was so embarrassed. She said, oh, I'm so sorry, And she said that gave her hope because it means that this teenager somewhere in her life is having conversations about making assumptions. And to her, that was a really bright light that maybe she won't always, because she's Asian, be thought that she's a service provider, a waitress or something like that so often had happened. And so I thought, oh, that's really wonderful that it happened. And it's really wonderful the take she's taking on it. That Julie finds hope in that. And as I say, I really recommend that interview because you get a real sense of the depth of her experience and what she has, just the thoughts that she has had. I'm having trouble talking about it because it's so recent that I saw it. But one thing she did mention that she and her mother and her father have had conversations about their experience. And they have found that each of them felt guilty about what was happening to them when they first got here, that, her father felt guilty because he had brought them and they were having these awful experiences. Her mother felt guilty because she hadn't protected their daughter enough. And the daughter felt guilty because she was causing so much trouble, maybe. And so when you talked about what happens to families, and I think that's a lot of it, is that everyone is feeling guilty for the way that everybody is probably feeling. They think it's their fault that they're having all these difficulties and these experiences. And then you lay that on top of the fear that they're all having. And so there's the fear and the guilt, and never mind that they're also very poor. And we've got to do a better job about welcoming people here. We just do.
Thank you, Scarlett. I think that writing the book, she says too in some of her interviews, it's very liberating. It was something she was afraid of. She didn't intend for the public to read this. It was going to be, I guess, her therapist or I can't remember who it was, but basically said, well, just write it for your grandchildren. Nobody has to see it. Just put it down, Yeah. And it was just, you all this stuff is secret and it's hidden. And once she wrote it, she was fearful of her parents reading it, and they didn't find out till I think it was already going to appear on the bookshelves, and she had put off telling them about it and was very fearful. And of course, initially, I think her mother said, "Oh my gosh, people will think I'm the worst mother in the world." But ultimately, the parents felt liberated. They said they felt they didn't have to live in fear. I guess it's out there. You're not hiding these secrets. They felt free. So it was actually very liberating for that whole family. And I think it was very healing for them to have her put this book out there. So I don't know. Do you have thoughts about, I know Nancy talked a little bit about people telling their own stories. What is the value in that? I mean, like if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell your story. So is there a value in people telling their own stories? What do you think? And you can answer this without having read the book.
Claudia,
Yes, Nancy?
one of the things I liked most about this book was I felt like she was an astute observer of her life and what was going on, even as a child. So her story, when she finally decided to write it, it actually shaped her whole life and who she ever became. And I didn't look at anything she wrote as like a negative or anything. This was her experience. This was her life. This is what she lived. I don't know that she was really asking us to say, oh, school was horrible or whatever. She found things to save her. She found things that allowed her to just keep moving on in life and become who she finally became. And I know she talks about seeing therapists and things like that, but she is who she is, shaped by what happened to her. She had no control over any of it, really, none of it until she was an adult. Everything else was just thrown at her from her time in China, being this child that her parents just doted on and loved, and there were relatives, to coming here and seeing the realities of living afraid, not having, I mean, she was hungry. She had nothing, no toys, no nothing, while she watched everybody around her having all these things. So to me, she's the only person who could have written that story, and maybe even written a story so emotionally that it grabbed me and made me think, this is reality. This is what it was. Who knew back in that day that somebody like her was working in these sweatshops? It wasn't exposed, obviously, not like it is today. So she's the person who could write that book, and she did it, and she did an extremely good job doing that.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, I just think that, we can research things and we can write about what we think other people's lives are like, but how can anybody ever truly describe somebody else's life? And I think that's why it's important to read these kind of books. You need to know what other people are going through. You need to, this humanizes people. Without this, again, we have just these two-dimensional stereotypes that we have. And, without meeting a person and getting to know a person or reading about their life, we have no idea, what their lives are like. Yeah. Cindy?
Yeah. I listened to a bunch of interviews, and everyone is different, and they're wonderful. You just put her name in and you get all kinds of stuff. But she has, many people have asked her if she's going to write a book beyond her 12th year. And she's going to. She said that she's in the middle of writing a novel right now, but she says that she intends to tackle that after the novel. So there'll be she didn't refer to it as a sequel, but it'll be, talking about what happened after they were in Canada. So I thought that was interesting. There were a couple of things that I also got from the interview, Scarlett, that her name is Qian Julie. I think I mentioned she chose the name Julie for the book, but when she was talking about it, so many people pronounce her name incorrectly, and to hear it, then that I can pronounce it correctly. But people like with English names, Mary Beth, Mary Ann, Julie Ann, there's a lot of double names, and somehow Qian Julie it's a little more difficult for me to to say. Because it's two languages. And I thought, it bothered me that I was thinking that. But I guess to be bothered is a good thing. And a couple other things. I thought this was interesting. When she wrote the book and she was encouraged to get it out there, she wrote to a whole bunch of publishing companies and to get it out there. And she got rejections. And one publishing company said, well, we already have one Asian author. And then he said, do you happen to know her? And they talk about like, whoa, it's like, I just thought it was just amazing. But obviously Doubleday picked it up and they flew with it. So that was really a good thing. Let's say, regarding her parents, and, I think we all do the best we can with our situations, our circumstances. And, I know her dad was doing the best he could. And, when he didn't let her have that cat, I just broke my heart. And,
Yes.
but he obviously was not able to empathize with her and what her needs were. But I mean, I think we do the best we can in our circumstances, and we can always look back on things and say, I should have done it differently. But in the moment, we do the best we can do.
Right. Thank you.
One of the things that struck me, having worked with tutoring, primarily Mexicans, tutoring in English and learning from them, one of the chapters in the book, Qian's father, who's working for the lawyer, and he describes some aspects of the lawyer, and he states that the lawyer hasn't made many citizens, but he's made lots of money. And the lawyer was involved with getting people citizenship. And I've seen this firsthand, where there are lawyers out there supposedly helping individuals gain their citizenship that charge enormous amounts of money and don't get very much done, which again is sort of a sad commentary on taking advantage of people, but it does happen, and it's still happening. And the other thing I wanted to mention, even though there's a lot of, to me, one of the themes in this book was poverty, and trying to deal with that, even though that wasn't a word that she was using, but I think that was part of the theme. And yet, like Nancy said, that was her life, and she dealt with it. And I think the hope that she exudes and still exudes, if you listen to some of her commentaries, the hope that she currently has as well, I think is wonderful.
I just want to capture the comment that Meryl left in the chat. So Meryl wrote, she worried that if she didn't follow her own routines, that terrible things would happen. For example, when her mom had to go into the hospital, that made her emotional load even more horrible.
And I think about that, when she was supposed to graduate from whatever grade she was in, and she was taking care of her mother and just trying to be a little adult, and she wasn't able to participate in all these fun school activities that preceded their graduation. And her teacher reprimanded her, and just said, well, if you don't take part in all these activities, you're not going anywhere in life. And all through this book, she has dealt with everything and held it all together. And it was the saddest part, I thought, was where, and she went in, I think she went in the bathroom or something, but she just broke down and cried and cried and cried. It was just like all of this just came down, and she's just one little girl. And it was just at that point, it was just too much. But I mean, I think she succeeded a lot because of her perseverance. I mean, the teacher also told her that she was not going to get into this school that she wanted to get into, that it wasn't for her. And she went ahead, even her father said, you have dreams, but, don't be disappointed when they don't happen. So you see her father's being crushed and saying like, your dreams aren't going to come true. That's nice that you have them, but she applied anyway without telling anyone, and she got accepted to this school. So she made up her mind, I'm going to get into this school, and she got in. And even like her writing, she worked so hard to teach herself how to write, and her teacher thought that somebody else had written her papers because they were too perfect. So she would put in grammatical errors and spelling mistakes so that he would accept her papers. And then of course she said, like when she was 9 years old, she said, I'm going to be a lawyer. And that's what she is today. So, she was underestimated all along. She's just this immigrant child that can't speak English. And I don't know, it's just, this underestimating of people that we do and this stereotyping of people that we do.
I just wanted to comment on children, and especially immigrant children that we might have had in our classrooms, or we see on the street, or we see in the library. These children are dealing with so much, and I think she put that into such a way with all that she's going through, and they're the link for their family to this community, this country, the culture, the food, the clothing, and it must so pull these children because they want to be part of the culture that they're brought up in, and yet they want to so belong and have pizza and have clothes that look like everybody else's, but maybe their parents are giving them other cues, and how they navigate all that was so powerful. And I think she dealt with that so beautifully and kind of laid it out in such a way that if we haven't had that experience to see what kids are dealing with, she really helped us feel that in a very powerful way. But I think these kids are just so resilient and just have so much to share with we adults if we can come in contact with them in some way.
Thank you, Anne. I know it's an education for us, but I think too, like she pointed out, a lot of children read these books and like, oh, I thought I was the only one. I felt all alone. And so they read these stories, from people who've experienced things like they have, and then it lets them know that they're not alone. Anybody have like some insights or anything that they took away from the book? Something, I don't know, just even educational system, there's different things. I don't know, something that maybe you hadn't thought about or thought about in a different light.
I just want to, there's another chat that I wanted to capture from
Okay.
Nancy. Nancy says, sometimes in protecting our loved ones from disappointment, her father, we hurt their self-confidence. It kind of sounds like it goes along with what Anne was saying.
Yeah.
Nancy, but go on with your next question, Claudia.
Hello.
Okay.
Hi.
Who we got?
Hi.
Anne?
Anne.
Okay.
Quickly, I feel very blessed because I have 2 Filipino granddaughters, and my grandson is now engaged to a Chinese American girl, and they're beautiful people. When I was in the 50s, I spent the summer in Chicago at a community center which served Nisei, Japanese American families and children. And I think my love for this culture just seemed to blossom through the relationships that I was able to make with these children and families. I don't really have much to share here, except that I was very interested to know today. I feel I don't want anything adverse to really happen and ill thoughts to be directed toward my family members. It's rather selfish, I suppose, but they are such beautiful people.
I know that There's anything, does somebody have their hand up? Okay. There's been a lot, in the news lately about attacks against Asian Americans. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that or why you think that's happening. And I know that there's a chapter in the book too where Chen's mother works in a hair salon. It's, these are the only jobs that she can get. And even though she's a published author in China and she knows computers and she's an intelligent woman, when she came here, all she could get were these degrading and menial jobs. But it kind of implies that, that Asian women were sexually stereotyped. And I know that in the news, they said there's a disproportionate amount of Asian American women who are victims of attacks. So Asian Americans are being attacked. I mean, that's on the rise, but women in particular are receiving these attacks. And I wonder what you thought about that and what's motivating it. You had any ideas or what we can do to change the situation?
Hi, that's dark. I'm just stepping forth regarding that, not addressing the females, but I have a 10-year-old grandson who is Taiwanese. He's and he's a delightful little boy, and he plays in sports. And recently, he was at an event, and out on the ice, this other little child decided to tell him that he did not belong here and he needed to go back where he came from. And that was such a horrible thing for him. He just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. But I have to say, the thing that really warmed my heart was that his entire team gathered around him. They experienced his pain. So as a whole group of 10-year-olds, they felt what Qian was feeling. And I'm hoping that as they grow, they take this with them, and the attacks stop, and that they can understand a little bit more and offer more compassion and sympathy. Today, I'll tell you, he's smiling. He's a great kid, but that was really a devastating blow for him.
And I think that's why, too, it's important with our children. We're adults and we're reading these things and we're learning these things, but I think our children need to learn them, too. And I think in schools, I know, like when I taught, we did units on tolerance and history of the United States, and we read about different groups. And I think that children need to be educated as well as adults, and it needs to start, in the schools, and it needs to start at a young age.
Well, you asked about where you think this comes from and why we're experiencing it when people in the very highest levels of government call a disease the China flu. And it's no wonder that we have this kind of prejudice and bigotry and violence toward a group of people.
Right. And that was in a history book that I read about Asian Americans. It's talking about whether you're accepted or not. It has a lot to do with what's going on in the world. One day you're accepted, the next day you're the bad guy, So like you were Chinese, the Chinese laborers, were treated very badly when they were building the railroads. And then it's like when we were at war with Japan, then the Chinese were the good Asians and the Japanese were the bad ones. And it was just like it, depending on who you're at war with or whatever's going on, things change, whether if you're Muslim in this country after 9/11, then all of a sudden things changed for you. So you're at the mercy of these changing winds, I guess. I don't know what you want to call them, politics and again, people in leadership and what they're saying. So it's something that we need to educate people on.
And I think that's why reading books like this is important, both for adults and for children. And I also think it's important that we help our children and our friends and relatives by impressing upon them the need to vote in elections, both local as well as state and national.
I just realized it's 4:00 already. Do any of you have suggestions? I mean, like, this is what we're trying to do, just to educate the public and, just to raise awareness on things. And so just reading about things, I think, helps. But if you guys have ideas, that you think we should be doing in the future to raise more awareness in the community, let us know, or things that we could do differently. Cindy? All right, Cindy.
A couple of things. I wanted to address you what the boy said to your grandson. It turns out that the name of the book that we're going to discuss next week, the title is Go Back to Where You Came From. And it's interesting because the title of this book that we're talking about today, Beautiful Country, that is in Chinese, that translates, the Chinese word for America is beautiful country. And, you think about it and how ironic when you think about all that Qian Julie went through. And the book next week, Go Back to Where You Came From, I was telling my niece about the book we were doing. She said, that's a horrible, horrible title for a book. And it is, the author he's a comedian, and it's tongue in cheek. And he goes on, like the rest of the title is in the 10 recommendations for how to become American. So it's dealing with exactly what your grandson experienced. So that's a whole different kind of book, but it's very, very, very worthy. And also I wanted to point out, when you go down the ramp, there's the preschool at the elementary school, the children, the theme was Sarah Kremling, the youth librarian. She gathered a whole bunch of books about belonging, and that's what Qian Julie wanted to do, belong. And that was the theme of the books. And the children have just gorgeous, gorgeous illustrations. And, starting out in pre-K with the sense of belonging is something that we just mentioned about starting with the children. So I was wondering too, if people have questions that you'd like to ask the author. We actually tried to get the author to come to have because last year we had a session, but the price was a little bit more than we could handle. Quite a bit more. Considering on the New York Times bestseller list, I guess should have considered that. But anyway, I'm just curious. Do any of you have questions that you'd like to ask her?
I believe online, if you go to hername.com, I think there is a way to communicate to her, not directly, but indirectly, and possibly get an answer.
Well, so as Cindy mentioned the book, so next Friday we will be discussing Go Back to Where You Came From. This one's a little different from all the other books we've done because it's really not about an immigrant. It's about a Pakistani American who is treated like a foreigner in his own country, which is kind of what was also mentioned before. And he does deal with the importance of telling your own story. So I think it's a valuable book, and he makes it fun. I mean, it's a very serious topic. He's very satirical, but it's kind of fun to read too, even though it's serious. It kind of reminds me, if any of you've ever read like Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, where his very existence, was illegal. His birth was illegal. But he tells his story, and he'll tell the most horrific things, and you're laughing because he does it in a funny way, but it's serious. And I think sometimes humor is a way too to make a point. So, so anyway, I think it's a valuable book too, and I hope that you all will consider it, and that maybe you'll join us next Friday. And then our third session, we'll have a guest speaker. He's Pakistani American, and I don't want to misstate anything, but yeah. So join us in the third week. We'll have a speaker, and then the fourth week we'll have members of the community who will speak from their own experiences, people who live here in Penn Yan. All right, thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure to see all of you, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And I hope if you haven't read the book, I hope you read it.